The form that I'm going to discuss next is it's VA Form 21P as in Paul -530. Again, that's 21P-530. This is the application for burial benefits when a veteran dies. Now with this, before I get actually into the form, it's important to remember that must accompany this form to qualify. You'll need a copy of the death certificate, a copy of the marriage certificate, and a copy of the DD-214. And then basically I also recommend a copy of the itemized funeral expenses if they're appropriate, and include verification of payment that the expenses have been paid. So let me repeat that. What should accompany this form is a copy of the death certificate, a copy of the marriage certificate if appropriate, a copy of the itemized funeral expenses, and a copy of the DD-214. And the copy of the funeral expenses, not to be repetitive, should show that the funeral expenses have been paid, because this is a reimbursement. Now, there's different levels of reimbursement for survivors of veterans who pass away. If a veteran is buried at either a national or a state VA cemetery or veteran cemetery, obviously the reimbursement is less because obviously the internment is paid for by the respective cemetery, the VA. Okay, obviously, so my understanding is that if a veteran is buried at a veteran-sponsored cemetery, whether it be state or federal, the widow or a survivor is entitled to a minimum of $300 to maybe as much as $1,000. I mean, whatever that range is, you can look at it that way. If a veteran is buried outside the VA system at a private cemetery, I believe that you can get up to anywhere between $1,000 and $2,000. I think $2,000 is about the max. Don't hold me to that, but I'm just giving you what my experiences are. But the form is hopefully relatively self-explanatory. You have to provide the personal information regarding the vet up in Part 1, your current mailing address, and by the way, a person applying for this benefit would be the claimant. That's the claimant's personal information. You provide your name, middle initial, last name, your street address, your mailing address, your complete mailing address, apartment, city, state, country, etc., etc. All right. You have to show your relationship to the claimant, whether you're the spouse, child, parent, executor, or other, and explain it. Okay. In Part 2, you have information regarding the veteran. This is what you would get off of the DD-214. Date of birth, place of birth, date of death, which would be on the death certificate, place of death, which again would be on the death certificate, the date of burial. If the veteran is not buried, obviously you'll have to leave that blank. You'll have to provide the service information, which again you can get off the DD-214, the date the veteran entered the service, where he was inducted or joined the service, by being the geographic location, city and state, his service number, which may very well be the Social Security number and or the service number that's on the DD-214, the date that he was separated from active duty, again the place, what his rank or grade was, and what branch of service that he served in. All that information needs to be provided. If the veteran happened to serve under a different name, you have to explain that in item 12. As with all other forms, you have to show the veteran's Social Security number, or notate the veteran's Social Security number on the top of the page. In 13A, which is on page 4, you have to put the type of burial allowance requested. If it's a service-connected death, you want to check that off. If it's a non-service-connected death, you check that off. If it's a VA medical center death, you check that. Then they want to in 13B, where did the veteran's death occur? You check one of those. It could have been at a VA medical center, a state veterans home, a nursing home, or other. And if you put other, you need to specify which again would be on the death certificate. and then they go through a series of questions which I hope are somewhat expensive. They want to know, if you are deceased, veteran spouse, did you previously receive a VA burial allowance? It's going to be yes or no. Most likely no. Did you incur expenses for the veteran's burial? Yes, and that would include cremation expenses. That would be any funeral expenses, any transportation expenses. They ask under 15B, are you seeking burial benefits for the unclaimed remains of a veteran? So, and then they go into Part 4, which is claim for plot or internment allowance. Now, as I said before, if the veteran is buried in a national or a state-sponsored Veterans Administration cemetery, then of course you need to indicate that. And there's the appropriate block to do that. In fact, you have to answer in 17B, was the veteran buried in a national cemetery or one owned by the federal government? Now, if it's buried in a state-owned cemetery, the answer there would be no. And then 17C, was the veteran buried in a state veteran cemetery? If it's yes, then you would provide that information. So they want to know if the federal or state government or the veteran's employer contribute to the burial. That's going to be yes or no. I don't consider life insurance proceeds applicable for that. I mean, that probably would be a question. In my opinion, I don't think you need to list any life insurance proceeds. It would be a specific burial expense policy. But they do ask for the amount of government or employer contribution if there was a contribution made by the employer, specific contribution made by the employer to the burial. There's on Part 5, which is the claim for transportation reimbursement, what I do is I put the total expenses, and you do want to send along an itemized list of the funeral-related expenses, including the cremation expenses if appropriate, casket, any transportation-related expenses, services, etc. And then you send that along with this form, along with, again, the copy of the death certificate, copy of the marriage certificate, and a copy of the DD-214. The claimant signs under 20A. I guess one of the things that's interesting about this form, they don't seem to ask for a date. I don't know why that is, but I wouldn't be too concerned about it as long as the survivor signs 20A and sends us in with the appropriate documentation. Hopefully you'll get reimbursement. So, I would say, people always ask, well, what's the turnaround time? I would say you've probably got to give it 60 to 90 days from the time that the VA receives this form. But it is a reimbursement. I'm also going to add, which isn't related to the VA, but it's my understanding that Social Security provides reimbursement for a death of up to $255 presently. So you can apply for that through the Social Security Administration, which is different, obviously. Thank you.